Thanks for listening to the PXP Podcast. It's a show about leadership, self-development, personal growth, and accountability. I'm your host, Jayme Yarroch. Now, you can catch our podcast on almost any podcast player: Apple, Google, Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and so many more. We're also on YouTube. You can find us at pxppodcast.com, and of course, you can always find us on our host on the Podbean app. Now, if you have questions, or if you want to hear a particular topic discussed, or if you'd even like to be a guest on the show, email me at ask@pxppodcast.com, or give us a call at 334-633-3300. Now, are you ready to kick off today's show? All right, here we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to PXP. We're coming to you live from the Cloffice, and that is the Closet Office. And if you're a new listener to the show, the Cloffice is about a 12 by 14 foot closet that also serves as the studio. Now, you'd be shocked at the number of commercials and ads and jingles and all that kind of stuff, even cartoon voices and all that kind of stuff. All of those voices or voice-related projects, you'd be surprised at how many of those are actually recorded in a closet. Many of the voices that you hear on commercials are freelance voice artists who work from home, and they'll tell you that one of the best places to record is in the closet, because all the fabric of all the clothes hanging and all that, it just deadens the extra noise, the echo, and it makes for a perfect studio. Anyway, I'm super glad that you joined us today. There is over 850,000 podcasts on the internet, and I'm super excited that we made it to your playlist, or at least we made it to your device today. And if we're not in your playlist, be sure that you hit that subscribe button. That'll make sure you don't miss any episodes. So every time that we release an episode, it'll pop up in your podcast feed. And be sure to invite your circle too. If you like the podcast, chances are that they're going to like it too. Well, it's raining here in Alabama today. We've got some storms on the way. In fact, schools are even letting out early. I think my kids are going to get out at 12 o'clock today, and that's going to allow, they said, for the buses to be able to finish their routes before the bad storms arrive. Now, my kids are all driving, but they're letting schools out at 10 o'clock today, and they're delaying them tomorrow. So apparently they're thinking that the weather's going to get pretty bad. Hopefully, it doesn't get as bad as what they're thinking, but they're preparing for it anyway. So today's podcast is going to be short, but it's super important. And I heard a short snippet of a video that Greg Gray posted on LinkedIn a few days ago, or probably a week or two ago now. And I wanted to expand on that just a little bit on the podcast because it really hit me. It's a really important topic. And if you've never heard of Greg Gray, I encourage you to go check him out. You can Google him. You can go check out his website. He is one of, if not the best motivational speakers / trainers or seminar facilitators that I've ever had the privilege of listening to. And that says a lot because I've probably been to, over 100, maybe hundreds of conferences where I was able to listen to big name speakers. And I've sat under some of the best training in the world, working for some of the biggest corporations. And I've listened to books and read books, mostly listen. If you know me, I don't read, but I've listened to books written by some of the greatest minds, at least in the space that I gravitate to, and Greg Gray is just so good. And if he's not at the top, he's pretty damn close, I'll tell you that. I first heard him when I was doing some training with Allstate Insurance. Now, I owned an Allstate Insurance agency, and the company was taking a big rate increase at the time, and they brought in Greg Gray to train agents on how to have the conversation about rate increases. And I've gotten the chance to hear him speak one other time since then live, and his perspective and his insight is just so good. So I encourage you to check him out. His website is greggray.com, and that's Gray, greggray.com. I was scrolling through my LinkedIn feed, and that short snippet popped up, and Greg was talking about how sometimes our employees have a training deficit, and sometimes they have a will deficit. And boy, that just hit me hard. There's so much truth to that. And Greg, if you happen to be listening to this podcast, thanks for sharing that tidbit because, man, that's so true. So let's talk about these two things for just a minute. A training deficit. Maybe an employee comes into a new role, or they've been in that role for a while, and there's a new process that's come into place, but there's some training that needs to be done, and they either haven't gotten that required training, or the training wasn't sufficient, or they haven't progressed enough in the training that they've been given. Now, what I see oftentimes is that companies frequently don't provide sufficient training to the employees. They may come to the role with particular experience in an area, or they've got education in a particular area, and the employer just assumes that team member is able to just jump in, do the job, and without any specific training. And oftentimes that's just not the case, right? Oftentimes they need that specific training. Maybe your company or your organization, maybe you do it a little different, or maybe the process is a little different than what they're used to, or maybe they have general experience in the area but not in that specific task. And so there's a training deficit. And we're talking about, people that maybe are not quite getting it done to the expectation that it needs to be done, right? And we're talking about why that is. And oftentimes, as Greg said, there's a training deficit, but then sometimes there's a will deficit. A training deficit, we can fix that, right? Someone comes into a role, or they're in that role, and they just are not meeting expectations. The expectations have been clearly defined. There's mutually understood consequences that go with those expectations. There has been proper supervision. There's been proper training, or so we think there has been, but they're just not quite getting it. Perhaps there's still a training deficit, right? And in those cases, if we identify that there is a training deficit, this person has a desire to get it right. They have a desire to meet expectations. There's never a pushback. They're not making excuses, right? They're not coming up with reasons why they can't get it done, but they're just not meeting the expectation. And you need to identify, as a leader, is this person just suffering from a training deficit? Do we need to give them some more training? There's nothing wrong with that. That's not a knock on the team member. That's not a knock on you as a supervisor. Perhaps it's just a matter of fact. It's reality, right? Maybe we just need to take a step back and realize, hey, they just need to have a refresher. They just need to have a little bit more in-depth training. Maybe the way that the training was delivered wasn't how they gravitate to learning. Maybe the training was, here, read this manual, and they're a visual learner or an audio learner. I'm an audio learner. Like, if you want me to learn something, it needs to be in something that I can hear, right? Video works because I can still hear, but I can see what's going on, but I can still hear as well. But if you ask me to learn something and you just hand me a book, chances are I'm not going to excel at whatever you're asking me, because I'm an audio learner. I have to really work hard if that material that you're giving me is in print form and that's it. I can get there, but it's much harder for me to get there than it is if it's in audio or video, because that's just how I learn. And so maybe it's an identification of how this person learns and providing the training in a manner that helps them learn the best, right? So we identified that there's a training deficit. In that case, you as a leader, the onus is on you to provide the necessary training to get that person to the place where they can meet expectations. That's on you, right? The team member, now they got to be willing to put in the work. They got to be willing to put in the training. They got to be willing to do what is necessary, but you got to provide them that training. And that's a good place to be. Like, if we've identified that there's a training deficit, that's something we can fix most likely, right? And so if it's a training deficit, yes, we can fix that. Then on the other side of the coin, sometimes our employees, they have a will deficit. And by that, I mean, they're just not, the desire is not there to meet expectations. Like, they may be perfectly capable of doing the job. They may have the necessary training. They may have the skills. They may have the experience, but their desire to meet expectations or their will to meet expectations just doesn't exist. That's in a place, that's a totally different way that needs to be handled, right? That's a different set of circumstances, and we've got to handle that team member, that employee, or that direct report. We've got to handle them differently than somebody that's got a training deficit. Somebody with a will deficit, that person needs to be sat down. You need to have a conversation about expectations. Make sure that they understand what the expectations are, clearly defined expectations. No misunderstandings between the supervisor, the leader, the manager, whatever you want to call that person, and the team member. We both are on the same page. This is what the expectation is for this role. And these are the consequences if those expectations aren't met. It's super important that expectations, clear expectations, are given, and then the consequences of not meeting those expectations are also provided. So many times I think it's easier for us to just say, well, this is the expectation of the role. It's a harder conversation to say, now, if expectations aren't met, these are going to be the consequences, because that's a much more difficult conversation, right? There's conflict almost involved in that. As a leader, though, you've got to be able to have that conversation. You've got to be able to have the conversation with a direct report that says, here's what is expected of you of the organization. Me in a leadership role, it's my responsibility to hold you accountable to these expectations. And these are the consequences if we don't meet expectations. And that's just being upfront, fair, professional, honest with that direct report of that team member. And depending on how that team member responds to that conversation, you may or may not have something to work with. If the team member realizes, hey, my will, my desire to get this, my attitude, my willingness to put forth the effort, boy, it hasn't been there, but I want it to be there, and I'm going to fix it. Hey, you can work with that. But if you've got a employee or a direct report that says, this isn't my fault, I'm doing the best I can, or I'm working hard, and they're not, like their attitude, their effort, their desire, their teamwork, their communication, their body language, their nonverbal communication, you know what I'm talking about, and how they interact with their colleagues, like all that stuff will give you a picture of, well, this person just doesn't have a training deficit, they have a will deficit. And if you've made that determination, it's very possible that it might be time to find someone new. A training deficit or a will deficit. As a leader, it's up to you to determine which one of those is the issue. And then when you make that determination, now it's time to put in a solution to the problem. If you are facing a situation just like this and you just don't know what the next steps are, reach out to me. As I've said before, I offer 2 free coaching sessions to the listeners of this podcast. I want to help you get started down your road to leadership development. Plus, with 2 free sessions, that makes sure that we're a good fit. So don't hesitate. Reach out to me. Take advantage of those 2 free sessions. Maybe I can help you through at least the problem that you're having right now. And if we go no further than that, then it's a win for you. So send me an email, ask@pxppodcast.com, or give us a call or a text at 334-633-3300. Well, that's all the time we've got for today. Thanks for listening to PXP. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your circle. If you like it, chances are they're going to like it too. Most of all, though, I hope that something was said today that helps you to become a better version of yourself. I'm your host, Jayme Yarroch, and I hope you have an absolutely amazing day.